On January 29, 1902, the San Jose Evening News published a news article with the sensational title, "Crazed Girl Hurls Hatchet with Vim. Daughter of Former San Josean Goes Wildly Insane." That girl was Katherine Majors, the 44-year-old daughter of Alexander Majors. Katherine was born in 1858 to Alexander and Susan Majors in Nebraska City, Nebraska. At the time of her birth, Alexander Majors was at the height of his career. His freighting company, Russell, Majors and Waddell, held a virtual monopoly on freighting west of the Mississippi River, shipping over 16 million pounds of freight to western forts and towns. Not much is known about Katherine's early life, but the Deseret Evening News in Salt Lake City, Utah described her as a, quote, close student and thinker. Katherine held no jobs and never married, living with her mother for most of her life. Her grandfather committed suicide in 1873, an event the 15-year-old Katherine may have witnessed. By 1893, problems for Katherine began to emerge. Her father was no longer providing for Katherine and her mother, and they spent the next 3 years living off and on in the Jackson County, Missouri poorhouse. Katherine described herself at this time as, quote, having a nervous trouble that affects my memory and unfits me for employment. Katherine had her first public mental health episode on January 29, 1902, when she smashed the windows of her house with a hatchet and then threw the hatchet through a neighbor's window, believing she was being attacked by Christian Scientists. She had previously thrown a rock through her neighbor's window and slapped a resident there. She was arrested for disturbing the peace and sent to St. Joseph State Hospital, also known as State Lunatic Asylum No. 2. She was described as having temporary dementia and released shortly after. In 1902, dementia was not associated with old age and was a general term for any type of cognitive impairment. In 1880, the U.S. Census had created 7 official categories of mental disease: mania, melancholia, monomania, paresis, now known as neurosyphilis, dementia, dipsomania or alcoholism, and epilepsy, although patients were admitted to mental institutions for a wide variety of diagnoses. Katherine was arrested for disturbing the peace again in 1905 for threatening to shoot her neighbors with a revolver. During her arrest, the St. Joseph Gazette quoted her as saying, "I'll kill the first warden who comes to my residence to take me. Anyone else but an officer of the law or an asylum officer, and I'll treat them as any woman would." At the time of her admittance into the St. Joseph State Hospital, there was little differentiation between the seriously mentally ill, those with minor mental health issues, and those with other illnesses such as epilepsy or head trauma. In one case, a woman was put in the mental hospital much to her confusion. She was deaf and could not hear what was happening at the trial that put her there. She was an accomplished dressmaker with no symptoms of mental illness. Women were often placed in mental institutions for behaving in ways that male society did not agree with and had little recourse if they believed they did not belong in an institution. Admittance into an asylum was considered a matter of public record, and the Kansas City Star records many instances of women being sent to the St. Joseph State Hospital for what we would now consider extremely dubious reasons. Some of these accusations include being crazy on the subject of religion, drinking and staying out late at night, reading Darwin and other authors on the origin of species and evolution, writing letters to men while married, and in the case of one white woman, visiting with black residents and, quote, meeting them upon the most friendly and cordial terms. It was not uncommon for men to place women into a mental institution in order to obtain a divorce or gain other benefits. In 1892, Ida Luther was institutionalized in St. Joseph Hospital against her will, during which time her husband served a summons to court for divorce. She could not attend because she was in the hospital. Her husband obtained the divorce and remarried 20 days later. A similar story was told by Mary Gallagher in 1894. Julia Taylor alleged that she was, quote, forcibly dragged from her work by the sheriff and incarcerated in an asylum, later discovering that her mother had bequeathed a large amount of money to her, and it was her brother and sister who placed her in the asylum. At the time that Katherine Majors was institutionalized, Kansas City funneled most of its mentally ill to the state hospital in St. Joseph, although some were sent to the Jackson County poorhouse. Calls were made by the public in 1897 to build a Jackson County insane asylum, but the funding never materialized. The St. Joseph State Hospital was relatively well funded and housed over 600 patients with a staff to patient ratio of approximately 1 to 7 at the time Katherine stayed there. An article in the Kansas City Star in 1893 described the asylum in great detail, saying, quote, "There is a ward for epileptics, for chronic cases, for convalescents, for those suffering from acute mania, melancholia, or old age, and the separation of sexes is rigidly practiced." Patients had access to reading material and musical instruments. There was a dancing hall and billiard room. However, not all was rosy at the institution. Patients were expected to oil the floors, make beds, dust, polish, and raise crops and livestock. The hospital was mostly self-sufficient, built almost entirely on the labor of patients. Many were hospitalized against their will, and a lack of scientific understanding of mental illness meant that many patients were institutionalized who today could be treated with medication or outpatient therapy. There could also be abuse by hospital staff. In 1894, a patient in the hospital died after being beaten by an attendant. It is unknown exactly what Katherine experienced at the hospital. What is known is that after she was admitted in 1905, she remained there for the rest of her life. She died in the St. Joseph State Hospital 33 years later, at the age of 80. Her cause of death was listed as chronic myocarditis and senility. She would have been buried at the State Hospital Cemetery, which is no longer maintained and is on the current grounds of the Western Reception Diagnostic and Correctional Center. The location of her grave has been lost to time and was perhaps never marked at all.